Germany must become a National Socialist state. So much was clear for the Nazis during the Weimar Republic. Being a small and irrelevant party, the Nazis faced a near insurmountable task. Who would vote for them? With the benefit of hindsight, we can find out which group of people the Nazis addressed successfully and build what would become the new winning coalition in Weimar Germany. The National Socialist's first issue was one of geography. The party had its humble beginnings in the south of Germany, mainly in Bavaria, and to some extent in the north, especially Mecklenburg. Before 1928, the NSDAP experienced considerable losses, which also showed in a decline in the heartland, while experiencing some shift to the east like Thuringia. After that, they swept over Germany like a tidal wave, spreading to the north and especially the northeast. In Germany, there was one major difference between north and south, east and west respectively. This difference was religion. When the Weimar Republic came to an end, 63% of the population were Protestants, around a third was Catholic. In most regions, one denomination dominated clearly. The Catholics were in the west and south, as well as in Upper Silesia. The rest was Protestant. At the start, religion had no importance for the National Socialists. This began to change in 1930 with the first major electoral win. Even in 1928, Catholics and non-Catholics were about equally susceptible or resistant to the NSDAP. By 1930, a roughly twice as high proportion of non-Catholics as Catholics voted for the Hitler movement. This difference between the denominational groups intensified once again in July 1932. The difference shrank again in November 1932 and in March 1933, but the Protestants' domination of the Nazi voter base continued. Therefore, one of the few social groups in the Reich which were hardly infiltrated by the NSDAP were the Catholic Zentrum voters. You can find more about this party in my video on the conservative parties of the Weimar Republic. Interestingly, it was easier for the National Socialists to approach the Catholics in areas with Catholic majorities than in regions with mixed religions or a Catholic minority. We can speculate that the party affiliation might have been an instrument for the Catholics to differentiate the subculture from the Protestants. Falter presents the social dynamics behind this. The milieu approach presupposes the existence of a dense network of everyday social contacts with other members of the milieu, contacts through which the corresponding milieu norms are conveyed, reinforced in a psychological sense, and monitored by social control during the course of social influence processes. These prerequisites are probably stronger in the countryside than in the city. In more urbanized areas, with the greater social anonymity and as a result, the lesser social control, the chance of encountering politically dissenting individuals and being exposed to competing information offers is undoubtedly greater than in the countryside. Deviations from the milieu norm are easier. The churches as institutions played a role too. Being a Catholic did not only mean that one should vote for the Zentrum, but not to vote for the Nazis was an even much stronger imperative. Nazis and the Catholic Church were strict enemies. Until the Reichskonkordat on the 20th of July 1933, this was not only communicated by the Catholic Church clergy, but also showed in disparaging comments about the Church by Nazi officials. In contrast, the Protestant clergy, although unofficially favorable towards the National Socialists, lacked such signals. Still, Waldmann showed that church-integrated Protestants were less likely to vote for the NSDAP in contrast to all the other Protestant voters. It seems like the National Socialist ideology was at odds with Christianity in general, not just a specific church. The Catholic Church's signals against Hitler's party only added to that. All in all, active Catholics was the group most resistant to the Nazi takeover. This tells us that the word Nazism is an irony of history. It derives from Nazi, a short form of the name Ignatius, which was common in Catholic Bavaria. Naturally, there was a difference in the voting behavior between men and women. Women tended to vote for conservative and religiously oriented parties, foremost the Catholic Zentrum, but also the liberal DVB and the nationalistic DNVB. SPD and DDP were pretty balanced, while the KPD was dominated by male voters. The Nazis had a surplus of men among the voters, at least when they were a minor party until 1930. This only changed slightly in the elections of 1932 and then distinctly in 1933, when the NSDAP managed to pull a lot of non-voters and female voters became relevant. Such a change occurred mainly in the Protestant areas in the Reich. In the Catholic states, women remained loyal to the Zentrum. All in all, while the NSDAP was male-dominated in its earlier years, when the voter base exploded, the difference regarding the sexes became less and less important. There were also changes in the age structure over time. The common picture of the young Nazi party soldier seems to be inaccurate. Before 1930, it was mainly the 19 to 24 years old who joined the party. From 1930 to 1933, new members were largely in the middle or at the end of the 30s. When the Nazis took power, the average age of the members was a little bit over 30. When looking at the voters, the picture is different. Since this factor is weaker than other influences like religious orientation as well as urbanization, Falter comes to the conclusion that if anything can be said about the age of the Nazi voters, it is that with rising age a voter was more likely to cast a ballot for the Nazis. Personally, I venture to guess that the picture of the young Nazi originates in the fact that one is more likely to find a 20 years old fighting in street brawls than a 60 years old. The socioeconomic class of the voters are probably the most discussed issue when talking about the National Socialist voter base. I guess this is due to the irresistible temptation to call the other side Nazis by aligning similar voter pools. During the Weimar period, 45% of the electorate were workers. This included relatives as well as pensioners. 30% came from the old middle class, which means self-employed workers who ran their own small businesses. The new middle class consisted of white-collar workers and made up 20%. This categorization was made according to the state-run insurance, so be careful. For example, being categorized as a worker only meant that you paid to the respective insurance. It does not give us the full picture, since it does not take into account income, qualification and other issues. For example, a qualified worker could easily earn more than an office hand. The first one would be categorized as a worker, the latter one as white-collar employee in the new middle class. Finally, the smallest category consisted of the upper class as well as the upper middle class with around 5%. There's another issue to keep in mind here. A citizen was eligible to vote at the age of 20. For the workers that meant that 1/6 of them were not part of the electorate. It is the workers we will first investigate. Until 1930, 40% of the new members of the NSDAP were workers. Until 1933, it was 36%. When looking at the ESA only, the number went up to 60% between 1929 and 1933. However, this does not necessarily translate to the voters. Many sources conclude that the workers showed a high resistance against the Nazi takeover and would not vote for them, no matter what. We can suspect that the motivations behind such statements are not entirely scientific. In the words of Falter, contrary to the traditional view, there is no clear statistical correlation between the total proportion of workers and the electoral successes of the NSDAP. There is even a weakly positive correlation between the proportion of employed workers and the NSDAP results. The results get clearer when further disaggregating according to the economic sector. It turns out that the agricultural workers were drawn to the NSDAP. In contrast, industrial workers were less likely to vote for the National Socialists. The comrades in other sectors were so too, although only marginally. Falter suggests that it had something to do with the already existing parties. Only in a narrowly defined number of cases where a high concentration of often unemployed industrial workers goes hand in hand with a strong traditional affiliation to one of the two classic workers' parties, the share of workers at the territorial level proved to be a factor of resistance against the emerging National Socialists. In short, the SPD and the KPD were both organized in industry, and so they got the vote of the hammer, while the Nazis got the vote of the sickle. That being said, from 1932 onwards, more workers decided to vote for the NSDAP than for the SPD or the KPD. What seems to have played a role was the level of the individual workers' qualification. Unskilled labor was much more prone to vote for the NSDAP. Employed in small businesses and without special occupational skills, these workers represented the least organized elements of the blue-collar population. Immunization against the National Socialist contagion, an effect of participation in socialist and Catholic organizations, did not extend to this element of the labor force. Childers' explanation gives more credence to the argument that adversity towards Hitler was at least to some degree driven by the social institutions in which the individual voter was embedded. To continue, we should also look at the economic situation of the workers, and that means unemployment. A prominent argument is that unemployment created the success of the NSDAP, like we see in this graph. It shows the NS results in the elections as well as the unemployment rate. Both plots are nearly the same. However, when looking at the absolute numbers instead, the correlation becomes much weaker. It turns out that areas with high unemployment rate did not become Nazi strongholds. Instead, the communists dominated there even when controlling for factors like urbanization. But this only holds for blue-collar workers while the correlation nearly vanishes for white-collar employees. However, the fact remains that the NSDAP gained votes in a period of rising unemployment. Indeed, the influences stemming from unemployment on the success of the NSDAP appear to have been highly indirect in nature. Undoubtedly, they contributed to a general climate of fear and hopelessness, which also affected voters in regions that were relatively spared from the scourge of unemployment. Due to social structural factors and the dominance of right-wing political traditions, especially in Protestant areas, residents tended to manifest a shaken confidence in the party's ability to solve economic problems by voting for the opposition that seemed suitable to them. Now, let's concentrate on the white-collar workers. They made up 13% of the electorate. On average, they were relatively young, with a fifth of them not eligible to vote. On the other hand, their average higher education meant that they were more likely to vote. In historical observations, the affinity of the white-collar workers to the Nazis is just as adulterated as that of the blue-collar workers. While earlier sources saw the non-manual workers as a major faction in the Nazi voter base, Childers found out that this category of voters was more affine to the DNVB and the liberals. Falter, using different methods of regression, comes to a supporting conclusion. The confidence is growing that employees overall did not show a particular susceptibility to the NSDAP. In fact, they even voted for National Socialists less frequently than the average of all eligible workers. If there can be any talk of an above-average susceptibility of employees to the NSDAP, then it is limited to the Catholic employees. You may ask for the reason. Falter speculates that the main factor was that blue-collar workers were hit harder by the depression than non-manual employees. Additionally, a lot of Nazi agitation was directed against department stores, the working places of the employees. Furthermore, 39% of white-collar workers were women who generally preferred conservative parties. A special group of employees were the 1.5 million civil servants and professional soldiers. Civil servants with higher income quickly joined the Nazi Party from 1928, with lower income employees only joining later in 1933. The civil servants suffered during hyperinflation, when 750,000 of them were sent into earlier retirement. During the Great Depression, Chancellor Brüning did not fire any public employees, but he cut the wages by 1/5 within 3 years. Although prices fell 17% at the same time, such measures were deeply unpopular. The Nazis took this opportunity and targeted this group in the elections of 1930 and 1932. This decision bore some fruits. In areas with a lot of civil servants, the Nazis got better results. Interestingly, this held especially in Catholic areas. All in all, the Nazis' popularity with the civil servants seems to have followed the economic situation. Then there was the old middle class. From today's perspective, we could describe it as entrepreneurs from every economic field possible. Therefore, this category covers a socioeconomic area of tremendous width. It includes owners of newspaper kiosks just as much as lawyers, farmers, and owners of big industries on the level of Krupp and Siemens. 40% of the entrepreneurs came from agriculture, mostly farmers, while 30% ran businesses in industry, trade, and services. These businesses were of small or medium size. As it turns out, this was the economic class most likely to turn to the National Socialists. Already in the first Reichstag election of 1932, The effect emanating from the proportion of agricultural self-employed individuals was, after the apparently always and everywhere dominating factor of denomination, the second strongest determinant of the NSDAP vote share. Overall, the analysis reveals that initially the percentage of commercial self-employed individuals and later the percentage of agricultural self-employed individuals had a strong influence on the performance of the NSDAP. There certainly were economic reasons behind the shift to the NSDAP. From 1925 to 1933, the income of the self-employed crashed by around 30%. In the year 1932, 18,400 farmers went bankrupt, and so did 50,000 trading companies and craft businesses between 1930 and 1932. This was due to the fact that such businesses could not cover the debt anymore. Furthermore, the protective legislation of Imperial Germany did not survive the turn to the Weimar Republic. There's also the aspect of community sizes to consider. Until the election of 1932, this element had no influence, but then the NSDAP became more successful in smaller entities compared to larger towns. Now, community size is not the same as population density, but there should at least be a correlation, and more dense areas tend to provide a higher living standard. Since the National Socialists were strong in sparsely populated rural areas, I'm tempted to speculate that it was the poorest farmers and craftsmen who were a relevant part of the NSDAP's power base. The NSDAP's strategists advertised themselves to the self-employed by moving away from the social revolutionary course of the Strasse wing and affirmed support of private property, thereby telling the small business owners that they could keep their belongings. They threw attacks against big department stores, hated competitors to demand par shops, into the bargain. When we look at owners of small farms, workshops and other businesses, we should also look at the families of such voters. In 1933, there were around 6.5 million homemakers and other dependents. With 90%, most wives of white-collar workers were homemakers, while this was only true for 78% of the women married to workers. More than half of women married to self-employed voters did work, mostly in the family trade. Women were less likely to vote for the NSDAP to begin with due to the conservative values. As expected, when limiting this observation to homemakers, this tendency becomes even more significant. We have already heard that the National Socialists were strong in agricultural and Protestant areas, and the old middle class, of which many were small and poor farmers. Their dependence multiplied the NSDAP's advantage further. There remains a last category to study, the 13 million so-called unemployed self-employed, which may sound like a contradiction, but it makes sense. Nearly all of them were retirees and the rest had similar fixed income. Naturally, this group was relatively old, had spent most of their lives in Imperial Germany, experienced the Great War and lost a lot of their income to the hyperinflation. If this brought them closer to the Nazis, you ask? No, at least not when you look at the party members. In 1935, with 2% of the members, they were grossly underrepresented compared to the 13% of them in the electorate. However, the member structure did not translate to the electorate. A retiree was more, although only marginally, more likely to vote for the NSDAP. All in all, we have gathered the following information. The National Socialists started out mostly in the south, but expanded to the north and the east, where they gained the strongholds. The voting behavior regarding sex is negligible, except that, at first, it was mostly men turning to the Nazis, while women stayed with traditional parties. NSDAP voters were more likely to be older. The all-dominating influence was the religious orientation. No other facet had as high an effect as the denomination. Catholics were the most resistant against the Nazi ideology, while Protestants had a bias towards the National Socialists. This factor correlated with geography. A high degree of urbanization was a disadvantage to the National Socialists, although this probably derived from professional categories. White-collar workers voted against the Nazis. Blue-collar workers voted against the Nazis too, although this effect was marginal. However, blue-collar workers must be separated according to urbanization. The Nazis successfully addressed agricultural workers, but failed to do so with voters in industrial professions. Regarding professions, public servants and retirees tilted towards voting for the NSDAP. Although in general the National Socialists were weaker in urban areas, this did not hold for city-dwelling self-employed. This group was drawn to the NSDAP at an order of magnitude comparable to the all-dominating factor religion. In rural areas, it was to a large degree small and poor farmers, their dependents, as well as the agricultural workers who supplied the votes for the National Socialists. All in all, a most diverse mixture of votes. This makes Falter gain the impression of an extraordinarily high stability of the NSDAP voter structure. After 1930, the social origin of the NSDAP electorate did not change particularly strongly. Only at the Reichstag election in 1933 did the NSDAP penetrate the Catholic circles somewhat more strongly, whereby this breakthrough remained largely confined to the Catholic rural areas. In contrast to the denomination factor, there were hardly any noteworthy differences within the NSDAP electorate between circles with above average and below average shares of workers, as could hardly be expected otherwise. Seen from its voters, the NSDAP was indeed a clearly Protestant-influenced party, but otherwise socially quite heterogeneously composed. No professional group dominated clearly, despite all the described over- and underrepresentations. The middle-class voters made up about 40% of all voters, the bulk of the party supporters, but workers formed such a significant subgroup that it cannot be said to be a pure or even predominantly middle-class movement. From the social composition of its voters and members, as well as from its territorial correlates, the NSDAP was the most socially balanced of all major Weimar parties. In terms of the social structure of its supporters, it came closest to the ideal type of the People's or Integration Party among all parties during the period before 1933. This result is not entirely surprising. The Nazis got 37% in free and 43% in relatively free elections. Of course, this cannot be achieved by missing out on drawing voters from major groups in the electorate. What we have gathered until now is statistical analysis. This does not necessarily allow us to come to conclusions regarding individual motivations. However, it suggests some deductions. For one, there were general social developments in Germany according to Falter. If one considers the long-term trends in socially leveling tendencies within the German social structure, where the convergence of consumption and lifestyle habits over the last 50 to 60 years serves as a key point of reference, it becomes clear that the party which recognized these trends early on had to achieve cross-class electoral success. Unfortunately, it was the NSDAP that exploited this tendency toward community for its purpose ahead of other parties. By framing their election campaigns in terms of overcoming class and party conflicts, they thought to satisfy the desire of harmony among significant portions of the German population. And then there were the general economic issues. Economic distress seems to have led to a kind of sectoral radicalization among the electorate. Voters affected by unemployment tended to vote for left-wing radical parties, while the old middle class, primarily affected by growing debt, shifted more towards the NSDAP. By turning away from the more or less democratic Weimar parties, significant portions of the old middle class and many voters from other social strata seemed to exhibit a form of punitive behavior. Initially, established political forces were held accountable, and later the entire political system, for their apparent inability to cope with the pressing problems of the social and economic crisis of the 1930s. If the consequences had been less horrifying, one might characterize this punitive action as a rational political act in context of modern political economy. We cannot leave this investigation without adding a warning. The statistical analysis looks at areas where certain cultural or socioeconomic groups predominate and compares them. Such an approach might lead to misapprehensions. For example, let's say in regions with many unemployed workers we see a good NSDAP performance. This does not necessarily mean that the unemployed voted for the Nazis. It could be the middle class flowing to the Nazis because they fear the rising communists. The available data does not allow us to answer such questions to our satisfaction, so we must be aware of this problem. Küchler raises a similar point. He criticizes Falter's analysis insofar as his regression model does not allow conclusions to the individual level. What is left is the now solidly established fact that the NSDAP clientele was more diversified than those of the Catholic and of the left bloc parties. In part, this is a simple consequence of the heterogeneity of the lower middle classes. In essence, then, there's no need for a major revision of the traditional thesis that the lower middle classes provided the major support base for the Nazis. The new studies add important detail. However, by taking to catchy but rather vague labels like Volkspartei, People's Party, these refinements are easily lost. Here, the strong rhetoric is counterproductive. It tends to obscure rather than to emphasize the importance of this work. Sound empirical confirmation and additional refinements, this is the major achievement of the Falter group, and it is not a small feat. I find it misleading to claim that the major support for the NSDAP came from the working class, without proper reference to its operational definition. Küchler's argument is that due to statistical shortcomings, for example the classification of white-collar workers as workers in the German social security system, the NSDAP still was a party of the middle classes and had a weak connection to industrial workers at best. Of course, Küchler is not wrong here, and his arguments gave me food for thought and made me recall a statement by Neumann written in 1932. It is symptomatic that the call to vote by the ideological elite of the SPD for the election of 1930 was almost entirely signed by scientists, while practically exclusively artists advocated for the communists in a corresponding declaration. If, at least in urban areas, the Nazis did not draw their votes from workers, this leaves the voters who were classified as workers, but were mostly employed in white-collar jobs. These were not the industrial proletariat consisting of manual workers in factories. It was the more intellectual proletariat with some form of higher education. I will leave it at this point, since this is not a hill I'm willing to die on, and I could easily fail to see a more obvious explanation. The question is why it was exactly the Catholics and the industrial workers who had some resilience towards the National Socialists. Luckily, we have a theory debating this issue. It states that a prevalent worldview in a group prevents the takeover of another. That the social-cultural milieu was an important factor in the rise of the Nazis can be confirmed by looking at the election of Reichspräsident Hindenburg. While in 1925 Hindenburg was supported by a coalition of right-wing nationalists, among them the Nazis, this changed in 1932 when, with the support of the Weimar coalition consisting of Zentrum SPD and the liberals, he ran against Hitler. The stronger Hindenburg was in a district in 1925, the stronger Hitler was in 1932, as is perfectly illustrated by this graph. So there were institutions like the Catholic Church and unions, and then there were institutions which stood for the old empire, which did not exist anymore. This was an open wound, ready to be exploited. The NSDAP met an electorate which predominantly had not formed strong attachments to established parties. Where such ties had developed, as between the industrial working class and the left bloc parties, and as between rural Catholics and Zentrum, they remained intact throughout the Weimar period. The lower middle classes, parts of which are classified as working class in the census categories, outside the rural Catholic areas constituted the mass base of the National Socialists. The failure of the established parties to master economic problems laid the ground for the Nazis' successful mobilization of dissatisfaction. However, the people most directly affected were not the prime agents. Rather, economic crisis systematically eroded whatever system support there was in the first place. And in contrast to the situation after World War II, large segments of the population were latently hostile towards the democratic order right from the start. A largely unattached and disoriented electorate set the stage. Economic doom provided the trigger for the rise of the NSDAP. I will describe what makes this explanation so compelling for me through a personal anecdote. I work in heavy industry. As an employee in Austria, you are forcefully incorporated into the Chamber of Labor, which claims to represent your interests. Every 2 years, an election is held. Historically, employees in this industry, be it blue or white collar, are deeply socialistic. Hardly any voter could tell you the name of even one candidate before they get their ballot to vote for their representative in the Chamber of Labor. But still they go and vote, as they are told for the Social Democrat candidate whom they would not be able to recognize if the name of the party was not attached. And this continues nowadays, when the corresponding party is at a low point regarding successes in elections. Even while the party itself decays more and more, the fossilized union structures still exist and are as hard as ever. This describes the binding power of institutions. We need to close with a word of warning. At least in my home country, politicians and media call people Nazi in every other sentence. It has lost any meaning. I hope this video helps. Together we found out who voted for Hitler and thereby who were actual Nazis. Still, we should be careful to judge the voters back then too harshly. Think about all the votes you might have participated in. There's a good chance you hate ticking the box you have chosen, but hope you selected the least worst option. Maybe the voters back then did the same. Whenever we vote for someone, we give them power. This power can easily be turned against you and the people you love. Maybe the problem is not the candidate, but the power. This was the series on the political situation in the Weimar Republic. We found out where the Nazi voters came from, but not necessarily more about their motivations. This gives us some hints at the Nazi ideology. Of course, this is not enough to come to a final conclusion. I intend to continue at some point and add more pieces to the puzzle. Until then, stay critical, stay curious, stay free.